So as I told you earlier, President Donald Trump of the United States invited about 5 African countries to the Washington, D.C. for some sort of talks that would bring about economic boost, not only for the African countries, but again for the West. But then there are questions as regards why Guinea, why Gabon, Guinea-Bissau anyway, why Liberia, why Mauritania, why Senegal, when there are other African countries who have a fast-paced developing economy. And of course, what does the West stand to gain from these so-called trade talks with these African countries? And so I have Professor Iraki, who is a professor of Faculty of Business and Management Sciences at the University of Nairobi, join me to talk about this while we wait for the other guests to join. Professor Iraki, thank you so much for joining us on the conversation.
Thank you and good afternoon.
So, does this meeting between the U.S. president and the selected African countries excite you?
I think I was personally very surprised by this meeting. If a country like Egypt was there, Ghana was there, South Africa was there, or Kenya, I would understand. But these are small countries, and except Gabon, other countries don't have anything that I think is very strategic from American point of view or anybody's point of view. So I'm very curious to know why the U.S. president want to meet this particular group of countries. What is in Gabon? What is in Guinea-Bissau? What is in Liberia? What is in Mauritania? What is in Senegal? I think what I suspect is he want to have maybe a dry land, maybe an experiment. Then depending on how that meeting goes on, he can invite the other countries in West Africa, Southern Africa, Northern Africa, and so on, and maybe negotiate about some trade deals. But for now, I must say it was very surprising to me.
So when you say it's more or less like a litmus test for Africa, I mean, we can probably talk about Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, Algeria, the top performing economies on the continent, without having to belittle these other countries in respect to them. Why would the president of the United States want to use these other countries as a litmus test, so to speak, when there are other better performing countries that he could have approached for some sort of dialogue?
My speculation could be twofold. If you look at Sahel, France has been withdrawing from West Africa for obvious reasons. And Russia has been getting in to fill the void. So maybe the US is trying to fill that void before anybody else takes over. But if you look at the few countries that Trump is talking to, they don't have a lot of strategic interest. That's why I think it's a good starting point, so that once he engages with them, he can bring other countries aboard, and he can make sure that he deepens the relationship with these countries as a frontline countries. Remember the concept of frontline countries, so that once he gets these countries, the other countries neighboring them, the other countries far away, can come join in. Because if you ask me, these countries is meeting today, what key results do they export? What is their key strategic interest or key strategic item that they have on the negotiating table? It doesn't seem. Unless you think of a country like Mauritania that is in Sahel, that is supposed to be a bulwark against the entrance of the Russians and so on. So I think until these people meet, they negotiate, we see the agenda, there's still a lot that we can't say about this meeting. To us, as far as I'm concerned, it took us by surprise, and until we see the agenda, it will still remain a surprise.
But then some people argue that these countries, by no measure, can be tagged as small. I mean, we're talking about Gabon that is rich in oil. There is some sort of mining and agro-processing activities going on there. We can talk about Senegal that also has oil and gas in abundance. And of course, has the facility, so to speak, for businesses to thrive. We can talk about Mauritania that has mineral exports, growth, mining, fisheries, and of course, the tourism sector said to be blooming, and of course Liberia and Guinea that are also rich in several mineral resources, small-scale businesses, forestry and agriculture. But then having to have a discussion with the US, do you think they would benefit more than the US would benefit from this particular, whatever it is, the kind of talk that might be happening between them?
I think there's a question, there's a debate that is going on over and over again. When a superpower meets small countries like these small African countries, what would be the agenda? Who would benefit? What I suspect is that these countries have certain strategic minerals, probably rare earth metals, like the ones that China has control over, or the ones that are found in a place like Ukraine. And I'm sure when these superpower and these African countries meet, they'll probably negotiate for a deal. I think at the end of the day, in most cases, because these countries are going to export raw materials, and the US is going to get those raw materials and export them, it is really a win-win situation. So until we see the terms of trade, I believe that at the end of the day, the superpower of the US is likely to benefit more than these countries. After all, few of them are industrialized, like the US. They can't process those minerals. They are not exporters of key manufactured products. They are probably just going to export raw materials, and that's it. So I think it's a very asymmetrical relationship, unless we see maybe something like a GOA, African Growth and Opportunity Act, that is going to benefit these countries and give them access to the US market. But for now, let's see the agenda.
So with the United States president having to shun the West African region, the Sahel region, even East Africa due to insurgency and civil unrest, is this a big loss for them? Because we're not sure if Donald Trump will be extending this handshake to those regions.
I think the only way that this region is going to be beneficial is if America comes and makes sure there is peace. Remember, in the Sahel, we have jihadists, we have Russians there, and we have a lot of minerals that are still underground. So if the US can give them a good deal, if there can be peace in this region, so that if there have any resources to be exploited, they are exploited in peace, then citizens of that country benefit from the export of those raw materials. It's value addition. I think that we can say these countries are going to benefit. But for now, it is a question of wait and see.
Well, we can continue to wait and see, but then, you know, for a country, or for these certain kind of countries that do not have the resources, like you said, to process their raw materials, definitely it would probably mean they would be at the receiving end. But then, do you think these sort of talks could be a platform whereby they stake their claims and have some sort of discussion around improving on infrastructure that can help them process their raw materials rather than export them?
I think that's the talk they should be having, asking how can the US help us process raw materials, add the value to raw materials. Remember that as the US is meeting these countries, China is somewhere in the background, Russia is somewhere in the background. There are a lot of people who are interested in African raw materials, whether it is minerals, whether it is agriculture, or whether it is even the human labor. So what we look for is to make sure that these countries at the end of the day also benefit, so that it ends up being a win-win situation. And if it can be value addition, instead of exporting raw materials, the better for these countries. But traditionally, we have always seen these countries exporting raw materials and not benefiting as much as expected. So if US meets these countries and ensures that they are not just exporting materials, there's some value addition, I think the countries would benefit, US would benefit, and all of us would benefit, and it would be an example for the other African countries.
Well, Professor Iraki, interestingly, 4 out of these 5 African countries are on the list of a visa ban being considered by the US, but the same US wants to dialogue with them. So is that not probably a strategic way of boxing these mineral-rich countries into a corner?
I think that is one that has come out very clearly when the US is negotiating with other countries. They always have their strategic interest at heart. The other day, I found US cutting off talks with Canada. And Canada is a very big economy compared with the 5 African countries that US is meeting. So you can be sure that on the negotiation table, US must be after certain strategic interest. And I suspect most of them should be minerals. So it's not very surprising. I'm sure at the end of the day, whether they are on visa ban or if they are on visa ban, I'm sure before the visa ban is lifted, the US will extract certain concessions from these countries. That one you can take it to the bank.
Yeah, well, you're saying we can take it to the bank. This discussion, takes me back to the tension-soaked meeting Donald Trump had with the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa at the White House. Now, does Trump really have regard or probably place value on Africa like the way it seems as though he's portraying?
I think there's an ongoing discussion, because if you remember when President Trump in his first term, his view towards Africa was not very positive. But I think because of shifting geopolitics, shifting economics, I think his attitude toward Africa might be changing. I think Africa is seeing as a future source of labor, a future source of strategic minerals, and a very good geopolitical partner. But I think in his second term, U.S. President Donald Trump may deal with Africa in a more positive way. And I think what he is doing with those 5 countries should be a starting point. And I suspect there will be more engagements in future. And I hope in all those engagements, Africa will benefit in one way or the other. I hope.
Well, Professor Iraki, you remember that a couple of years ago when there was this economic turmoil in Europe, we had a lot of the representatives from that particular continent try as much as possible to court several African countries in terms of mineral exchange, trade, development, and all whatnot. And we've also had Russia and China try as much as possible to secure or to strengthen ties with these African countries. But then when you look at it, you discover that most of these African countries do not benefit, basically in terms of the materials being transported and the trade deals and the terms and conditions that go along with these talks. How are we so sure that this kind of negotiation with the West, based on antecedents, will benefit Africa?
And that's the biggest problem that I have, because African countries usually negotiate bilaterally. You have one country negotiating with the US, one country negotiating with China, another country negotiating with the European Union. But if we negotiated through, let's say, trading blocs, ECOWAS, SADC, East African Community, maybe we will probably get better deals. But as long as we negotiate unilaterally, we are not likely to get a very good deal. So I hope that in the future, when it comes to negotiating, these African countries will come together, negotiate as a bloc, negotiate through the African Union, African Free Trade Area, they will get better deals. But as long as we negotiate as individual countries, we are very unlikely to get better deals. Remember, US, other countries have strategic interests. We also have our strategic interests. But because we lack technology, we lack negotiating skills, we lack the numbers, we end up being on the receiving end. So one of the ways we need to improve as African countries is the way we negotiate with the big powers. We negotiate as a group, and if possible, we make sure that we have very good terms that we can extract, not just as a country, but as a bloc. And that's why European Union has been doing very well. That is why other blocs have been doing very well. Why should we negotiate as a number of small countries instead of as African Union or maybe a bigger bloc, and we have a bigger voice and get better terms?
All right, Professor Iraki, I'd like you to stay with me for a while. We have another person, Bamidele Ayemibo, who is the lead consultant at 3T Impex Consulting, who will also be sharing thoughts with us. Bamidele, it's nice to have you join us on the show.
Thank you very much. How are you today?
Of course, we're doing great. So tell me, is there anything that actually excites you about this hand of fellowship being extended from President Trump to these African countries?
I'm not excited, and the reason is the fact that this is not going to be a balanced negotiation. It will be good for Africa to begin to see how we can negotiate as with a united front as trade bloc. I see a situation where, of course, they definitely will have something up their sleeve, what they are trying to achieve. A good example of this is what I noticed recently. Nigeria has banned some goods for more than almost 10 years. When, after April 1, the Liberation Day of Trump, where he announced the tariff for different goods around the world, and Nigeria was 14, some other African countries were higher, some were 10. We noticed the United States Trade Representative tweeted about the fact that Nigeria needs to to remove some of those restrictions or prohibited items after almost 10 years. And this volume to me that, look, the reason why you are doing this is to get us to remove this restriction, which is done to protect local industries. I'm using that example to say that there is always a reason why this is being done, and it's definitely not in favor of African countries, so we need to tread carefully and cautiously So I'm not optimistic at all. I'm not excited at all. In fact, how much are we even doing with the US? I think beyond trade, US is looking for some other things, maybe minerals or access to some other things, not necessarily trade, considering the fact that the whole of Africa export to the US is just about 40 billion. Not even up to 40 billion. The whole of African export to the US. So it's not like we are doing so much that will require them, that we will benefit from, rather we focus on how we can deepen the intra-African trade or negotiate as a united front to any trading bloc or country, big country like the US or China that want to do business with us.
Now, earlier on, Bamidele, you said that it's not going to be balanced in terms of trade benefits for these African countries and the US. But then we have the AGOA that I'm not too sure if these African countries are part of. We understand that the US has a very big market that actually caught the eyes of so many countries because of its deliverables in monetary value. Don't you think that that's one way these, less income earning countries can benefit?
What you mentioned is a very good example of what I'm trying to say. Ethiopia and Rwanda have had issue with US under AGOA, in which they were yanked off that program because they took a decision. Particularly, I remember the case of Rwanda, where Rwanda prohibited the import of used clothes and shoes into Rwanda, and US moved them out of AGOA. Now, an African country taking the decision in its own interest to produce locally items that has been importing second-hand used clothing, used shoes. But because there is an economy in the US that cater to that, who buy used clothes and used shoes and ship it to Africa, and that will be affected. And guess what? They will yank them off AGOA. Why? Because they took a decision in their own interest. So meaning AGOA is not designed just to help Africa. It is to be used, in my opinion, negotiation tool. A tool to be used to get you to do what they want you to do, not necessarily even when that thing is not your own interest. Now that's a prime example of how AGOA has fared. So because US will determine if you are violating human rights, they are the one that will determine if you have done something that is injurious to the economy, even when what you have done is in your own interest. So AGOA is a good example of what I'm saying, the fact that this is not always in our interest. They are not Father Christmas, by the way. Whatever they are giving to you, they have an interest, and it's important you know what they're interested in and see if it's something you are willing to give before you go ahead into that kind of negotiation.
Okay, so Professor Iraki, so we are at the crossroad now. If we have an AGOA that is being described as a manipulative or exploitative tool, we also have the AfCFTA, an agreement that has been on board for years, but then has not really seen the light of the day in terms of implementation and boosting intra-African trade. So is Africa not the one putting itself in this disadvantaged position?
Africa has very good export market in terms of the US, in terms of China, in terms of the European Union, and many others. But at the end of the day, we're also talking about the African free trade area. So the question we should be asking is, which should be the African focus? Should we focus on the foreign market, or should we focus on the internal market, the African free trade area? And my argument has always been, let's focus on all the markets. Let's focus on the European Union. Let's focus on China. Let's focus on any market that we can get. If you look at China, or look at Japan, or look at Korea, they have grown very fast because they focus on the global market. So if you look at the Japanese cars, Korean cars, or Chinese cars, or Chinese products, electronics, and so on, they exported all over the world. So you've got American movies or American products and so on, they also exported all over the world. So I think Africans should not restrict ourselves with just the AGOA, with just the African free trade area. We should develop the market wherever it can be found. After all, what is a bigger market, European Union, American market, or the 7 billion that is the whole world? So let's not restrict ourselves. Let's focus on the world as our market. Let's not restrict ourselves. Let's keep on negotiating with whoever can be a market, and that's the only way Africa is going to develop. But in doing that negotiation, let's make sure we negotiate as a group, not as individual countries.
Bamidele, I'd like to get your thoughts on this. Now, US seem to be shifting away from its traditional aid-based models toward a transactional, business-oriented approach, according to the president anyway. But then, has Africa really benefited from aid programs, so much so that this summit would now ensure some sort of a trade balance?
It's not likely going to ensure trade balance. I mean, we need to fix our problem, problems that have hindered us from maximizing trade, either to Europe, to America, because the problem of Africa for trade is not just shipping to the US. Even international shipment within Africa, shipment to Europe, shipment to Asia, if we don't fix those problems, we're not likely going to maximize whatever trade agreement we find ourselves in. So, of course, we need to focus on trade, not aid, because aid basically is a tool. If you are producing and you are shipping, you can negotiate something that is favorable to you, particularly when you are exporting manufactured goods, value-added goods that is very critical. And you'll have noticed that the reason why EU will not be able to completely ban the product from Russia, despite all the sanctions, is because Russia is producing critical products that they themselves cannot do without. That is where we have to get into, that we're producing, we are so productive that if you are going to do anything to us, you have to think of what you stand to lose if you do whatever it is you want to do that will not be in our favor. Those are the things I think we need to look at. So we have had a different agreement, AFCFTA, AGUA, whatever agreement. Can we begin to look at not just signing this agreement, but also ensuring we make maximum benefit from this agreement? So it's not just be like, we're just signing an agreement for the sake of signing an agreement, but we're not maximizing it. But they will. That's another thing. They will, because for them to call you for it, they already have people who are looking for that market. In fact, there are people who have already informed trade representatives in the US who is informing Trump that made them to say, okay, let's have this conversation. They already know what they wanted. I'm not sure we know what we wanted as Africans, but we're going to go there to have conversation, and at the end of the day, might not be getting the deal we want. But it's a market we're considering, it's a market we really need to consider going into. But like the other speaker is saying, we should negotiate from a point of strength, leveraging on our population as African rather than individual countries. So
this now takes me back to the question around these countries involved. If we are going to have African countries negotiate from the place of strength, Professor Iraki, we have, like I said, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, Senegal. These countries, do they have the mettle, the pedigree, what it takes to negotiate from a place of strength when we have other African countries who are more vocal and have the economic might to negotiate on their behalf, but then are not part of this mix?
I think these countries, the question is, when they meet together, have they agreed on the agenda that they are going to negotiate with the US? Or are they just going to be taken by surprise and sit on the table and be given terms and conditions? So I'm hoping that these countries, by the time they go and meet the US, they have sat and negotiated, and they have their terms and conditions they are going to follow. But if they're just going to sit on the table and then each country brings on the table what it is looking for, then they are probably not going to be very successful. And I think one of the biggest problems we have in Africa, and I'm talking that from experience, is that we are very poor negotiators. If you go to the US, if you go to the European Union and so on, there are people who have been trained to be negotiators in trade. In fact, the US has even somebody called a trade negotiator, or somebody called, and I think he has somebody in charge of the US foreign trade, he even has a cabinet level position. But we have that in Africa. So because we are not very good negotiators, whether it is Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, or Senegal, we end up being on the receiving end. So, and one of the ways to negotiate very successfully is to make sure that we negotiate as a group. We do research in advance and know what we want to extract from the US or whoever we are negotiating with. But as long as we don't prepare, as long as we don't do research on negotiation, on terms of trade, we are already going to be on the receiving end. And I'm hoping that in the future, we are going to do better than we are doing now. As somebody pointed out, US has become very transactional. So when they meet you as an individual country or a bloc, they normally know exactly what they are looking for. But do African countries know exactly what they are looking for? Or they are just taken by surprise. So let's become better negotiators, and African countries will benefit more from trade, and they are benefiting more now.
Bamidele, now this sudden move to fraternize with these countries has been described as American diplomatic efforts aimed at actually finding some sort of a common ground between, the U.S. and these African countries. But then if you had to look at it geopolitically, based on what Professor Iraki had said earlier on, could it be out of fear of the growing influence that China has on the continent that the U.S. is now trying to probably, extend this hand of love to these countries?
Hand of love indeed. Yes, not just China and Russia, because of relationship of Russia with the Sahel alliance of Sahel states, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. I believe U.S. is interested in number one, minerals. Gabon is rich in manganese, so I believe is mineral contribute to this. Beyond minerals, so for example, Liberia rich in gold and increasing lithium and rare earth metal, which US is interested in. Also, there are indications of the fact that US also wants a military base, actually, military partnership. Mauritania and Senegal border the Sahel region, a growing terrorist corridor, and US is looking at having a military partnership, base, access also for training programs, and counterterrorism, logistic hub. These are some of the insinuations we're hearing on, but by the time the meeting is concluded, we'll be able to know exactly what they are really trying to get. But be rest assured that this is definitely in the interest of the US. Does not mean Africa cannot take advantage of it. We just need to negotiate in a way that also that favor us, actually. There are insinuations that strategic maritime access with Liberia and Senegal for military trade routes and security, critical minerals for Gabon and Mauritania as a means of supply chain diversification for US, considering the fact that US depend, for rare earth metal, for example, depend a lot on China. And now, of course, sign an agreement already with Ukraine on the same thing, but I'm not sure exploration has started. Counter-terrorism operation, Mauritania and Senegal, because of to buffer the Sahel security buffer. Because of the security offer, maybe that might be attractive, but that also will come with its own consequences. Whatever it is we are going to do, it should be such that we all think not just in the immediate benefit, far ahead of the far-reaching implication of whatever it is that is going to be signed. But rest assured that it's in the interest of the US, but Africans going to negotiate should also be in the interest of Africa. And like the other fellow panelists mentioned, that have we even agreed, the 5 countries, what are we going to be presenting? What do we even want? Can we even, as this 5 group, present a united front in this kind of conversation? Those are the kind of things I think we should be discussing. Thank you.
So in situations like this, one would always want to consider how African countries can put themselves at a vantage position and benefit more from this. But we are going to talk more anyway, most especially as it revolves around which global powers do you even think these African countries should be caught in, if it will be or can actually benefit more. So let's quickly go on a short break. When we return, we'll continue the conversation from that point. Do stay with us. And so President Donald Trump of the United States is trying to boost business or diplomatic ties with about 5 African countries. Some people will call them the golden choice of the West. Talking about Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal. And there have been questions as to what are the underlying factors, what are the underlying reasons as to why the U.S. would choose these countries when there are other countries that have been, so to speak, snubbed when we talk about how to improve trade on the continent. Is it about trade, actually? Is it about the fact that China is bearing in on the continent, or probably about the security issues? Who stands to benefit more? These are part of the questions we've been trying to answer on the conversation this evening. And of course, I've been talking to Professor Iraki, professor at the Faculty of Business and Management Sciences, University of Nairobi, and Bamidele Ayemibo, who is the lead consultant at 3T Impex Consulting firm. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for staying with us to talk about this. So I quickly bring Professor Iraki into this. Do you think that African countries are better off strengthening ties with China and Russia, who have shown more interest in developing Africa's infrastructure and security than the U.S.?
I think that's a quintessential question that everybody should be asking. If I give you an example of Kenya, China has been there for the last 2 or 3 decades, and they have built roads, they have built ports, they have built things that people can see. America has been there for a longer time. So I think what Africans are looking for is something that is tangible, something that they can see, something that can benefit the welfare of the African countries, or the welfare of their own people. So I think one of the questions everybody is asking is, if China comes to Africa, if Russia comes to Africa, will they do better than the West? Will they improve the living standards of the people who have been there? Now the question has always been that if you look at the relationship between Africa and the former trading partners, whether it is European Union, whether it is US, whether it is their former colonial masters, the trade has always been imbalanced because Africans probably export raw materials and export manufactured products. So my biggest worry has been that even if we engage with Russia, even if we engage with China or any other developed country, it might end up being the same. We end up getting manufactured products from China, from Russia, from other countries, and we don't end up exporting any manufactured products. So they are going to be on the receiving end. So when we engage with these powers, whether it is China, Russia, or whoever it is, we must start by asking, what are we exporting? Is it value-added goods? Is it value-added products? Or is it just raw materials? So it does not matter who we engage with, whether it is Russia, US, European Union, or China, or whoever is going to come on board, as long as Africa is just exporting raw materials. There would be much difference. There would be much change in the economic status of African countries and its people until we start value addition and we start exporting materials of higher value, not just raw materials. And that should be the starting point. That's what China did. That's what Korea did. That's what other countries did. They started exporting high-valued materials, high-value-added products, and that made all the difference. And that's what we do in Africa.
Okay, now, Bamidele, we see these 5 countries who have a combination GDP of about $70.7 billion in terms of contribution to Africa. And I remember a while ago you keep hammering on the need for these countries to come together and negotiate with the US from the place of advantage. Now, with this sort of economic value, what are the basic things they should be putting on the table in the form of negotiation with the US that would probably improve or accelerate growth, GDP, business, job creation, commerce, whatever it is that would benefit them? What should they be placing on the table that can help them?
Talk to the last question you asked, and then I'll come to this. And that has to do with which world power should you be talking to. Should be talking to people based on your need. If you're looking for infrastructure, China can help with large volume. EU, you can be sure of very good quality. If you're looking at market access, EU and US, and probably China can be good. If you're looking at digital and telecom as a sector you want to really develop, maybe India and US, and then China. Now, for the question you asked as to the, can you remember the question again?
Oh, so I said, what should be the form of negotiation? What should these African countries be placing on the table? For instance, when you look at the top performing economies of Africa, we are looking at $2.8 trillion in terms of GDP. But for these African countries, 5 of them is about 70.7 billion US dollars. And there's a need for them to improve on those indices. So by the time they'll be entering into talks with the US, what should they be placing on the table that can accelerate or bring about growth for their economies?
Market access, infrastructural development. Whatever it is that have hindered the economy right now from growing need to be part of the conversation. So for example, market access. But infrastructure development to be able to increase their productive capacity, maybe power, port, road, rail, whatever infrastructure that will be able to facilitate increased trade with the US. So market access in the US is very important, lowering the trade barrier as much as possible, and infrastructure development back at home. Anything that they'll be discussing, and if possible, security. Because of the terrorism in Africa, particularly in the Sahel region, these are the kind of conversation I believe they should be having. But more importantly, for them to know, they know their pain point. What is the pain point? Exactly that we believe if this is fixed, it's going to increase the growth trajectory of our economy. Those are the things, which is why having conversation among themselves, presenting a united front, then become very, very important.
All right. Now, Professor Iraki, we have a Donald Trump administration that has imposed about 10% tariff on baseline imports, most especially for about 51 African countries. Now, won't this tariff undermine whatever it is that the U.S. is hoping to achieve? Whether or not these African countries will be the first beneficiaries of whatever trade agreements that the U.S. will be having with them?
It's an interesting question because one of the things that has been very known for Trump leadership, past time and this time, is tariffs. And one of the ways to make to entice or catalyze trade between African countries is to reduce the tariffs. And if you remember recently, China said they are going to allow African countries, about 3 of them, to be exporting things to China duty-free or tariff-free. So I think US should probably follow suit, make sure that African countries can easily export their products to the US duty-free. And that will make the market access that my colleague is talking about much easier. But I think at the starting point, the question has always been, what are you exporting? Whether it is 10% tariff or 50% tariff, it's always a question of what you're exporting. Is it value added? Is it needed in the US? Can you negotiate and make sure that you get more value for what you are getting? So I think tariffs are going to be an important issue, but I think to me, as far as I'm concerned, the quality and the necessity of the products is probably more important than tariffs. Because if the US needs a very important products from Africa, I'm sure you can negotiate for the tariffs and they can go lower. But I think something else we are forgetting in terms of African trade in other countries is that we need more technology transfer so that we can make more products. We can export more products. Without technology transfer, then value addition will be very hard, and negotiating with other countries will be extremely difficult. But I think trading with other countries, Africa trading with other countries is work in progress, and we need to put more effort, either through African Free Trade Area, regional blocks, and I'm sure African can get better than what it is getting now.
Okay, now, Bamidele, let's be very realistic with ourselves. Can Africa escape neo-colonialism, where African resources, raw materials are being exploited and exported, you know, in meeting the demands of the global economy?
I mean, it's a sovereign state. It's all about negotiation. We can actually. The only challenge is, do we have people in power who will be able to have those conversations? Do they have the balls? They have the character, the confidence and competence to be able to insist on what they believe is in the best interest of their country. We shouldn't be exporting just raw materials. We should be adding value to it. In fact, we don't even have to complete it to finished product, because if you look at the trajectory of global trade in goods, which is over 24 trillion right now, and global trade generally with trade in goods and services about 33 trillion according to WTO, and about 24 trillion is trade in goods. About 50-60% is intermediate goods, meaning they are not raw, but they are not finished. Many developed countries don't want to run the way they used to because of the environment. Some still do, but a number of them are moving to intermediate. They don't want finish because of the job that finish will create for them. So that means we can come in between and do intermediate goods. That means from lead to lead ingot, from lithium ore to lithium ingot, from cocoa beans to cocoa butter, from shea nut to shea butter. Those intermediate products is an advantage, meaning we would have been able to get additional value, creating job abacabo, and also be able to ensure the partners is able to also achieve the objective of ensuring the value chain of that product create job for them. That's the kind of relationship we should be looking out for. That's why we need to be very clear on what we want and be able to insist. The challenge is this. The places we go to take loan, the World Bank, the IMF, we go to take loan, the major funders of those institutions are the developed countries, US being one of them. So even if you decide not to agree to what they are asking you, or you are going to need loan, from the loan you are going to agree, because the people that will provide the loan through IMF or World Bank to you are these people are a major shareholder in this organization. So you are not going to be able to, if you are still going to rely, which is where neo-colonialism comes in, if you are still going to rely on them for any kind of help, this is going to be part of negotiation. When the new administration in Nigeria came in, for example, we have what is called the 41 item, or item that were not valid for foreign exchange. Now, they could not get the former government to be able to stop it, to prevent, to allow those things to come into Nigeria and declassify them from non-valid for forex transaction. But now, we now have it non-valid for forex transaction. We now have it non-valid for forex transaction. So we now have it being removed, rather, when the national came in. You know why? When the national came in, they needed loan. And to be able to get those loans, they tell you, look, the people that will be making this form available are saying you are doing this in your country, you need to do this about this, prohibit this item you deem as not valid for forex, because some of the a number of countries were affected. In fact, I remember then the minister of, I think Norway, came into Nigeria because they export a lot of stockfish to Nigeria. And at that point, because it was part of the non-valid for foreign exchange item, they could not get Nigeria to stop it. At least the former CBN governor did not until this administration came in. That's just a classical example of what they do with African countries.
Okay.
That they can, if you're going to need that kind of help, then you must be ready to also do things that might not necessarily be in your favor.
Well, this would just actually mean that these African countries are actually playing themselves as puppets, so let me just say pets, into the hands of these world powers. We hope that they can actually take decisive steps to actually change the narrative if they hope to be in a better stead when it comes to negotiating with the world powers. Bamidele Ayemibo, lead consultant, 3T Impex Consulting, and Professor Iraki, Professor, Faculty of Business and Management Sciences at the University of Nairobi. Thank you so much for sharing your profound thoughts with us on the show today. We appreciate that.
Thank you for having me, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has made increasing business ties a key objective of relations with some African countries, brashly leaving out others at the moment anyway. Whether or not there will be some sort of a broader U.S.-Africa summit that will bring all African leaders to the table, one would expect that such marriage will provide more opportunities for economic development and growth for the continent. Well, that's it on today's edition of The Conversation. Many thanks for being part of it. And until next time, I am Lekon Onobanjo. Enjoy the rest of your day.